as well as get some more input from people working across and leaders working across in different spheres. So I'm very happy and pleased and honored to introduce to you Shailaja Chandra, who has been the former Chief Secretary of Delhi and who will be commenting from the perspective of someone who has deep insights into the administration. And we, of course, have Sunita Dha, who heads a very famous NGO. I think women empowerment is a very, that's what at least I know Jagori for. And we have another academic speaking to us by Krishnan from the Center of Development Studies. Now, before I give each one of them an opportunity to give their 10 or 15 minutes of comments on what they think the consequences of growth are, I would just like to review some of the themes we've been looking at today. And I thought there was a very nice transition from the morning session to the afternoon session, in the sense of that we were already speaking about social mobility as we were looking at the economic data. And I think this was very strong in Sabashia, so sorry if I pronounce this incorrectly, his paper, where he spoke about economic growth beyond the numbers. What do these numbers hide? Economic growth can be differentiated by those who actually contribute to economic growth and who get the benefits. So what he was showing us is that there were times when there was lots of small entrepreneurs, and then there are times when this is added on by large companies, large entrepreneurs, oligopolies or monopolies, or even multinationals, so that we can actually see that the consequences of social growth can be distinguished according to which class or which type of people are contributing and earning. Then in the afternoon, we went deeper into the social fabric and learned about education as a way of expressing aspiration for participation in economic growth. We learned about the village as a place for mobility and diversity as a consequence of economic growth. And we learned about a new habitus, or cultural learning as performative capital. And I think this was an important addition because it spoke about capital beyond money. So what else do you need in order to be mobile? And I think this reflects very interestingly also on caste, because caste very often is recognized not necessarily in terms of what you have economically, but also what you look like, how you dress, how you behave, what you eat, what you smell like. So there's a lot of cultural and performative capital that contributes to the stratification of society. I think one of the things we have learned is consequences of economic growth are a softening of inequality, but not necessarily a mitigation. I think a second thing I've learned in the morning by thinking about how we speak about Indian society today is that a consequence of economic growth is not just what we observe in the field, but also how we as academics, and hopefully we get some further input here, speak about Indian society. So that what we are observing in the field is changing the way we speak about Indian society. And I see two significant changes in the debates over the last 10 years. And that is one, that we have moved on firstly from discussion around neoliberalism and structural adjustment, which started with at least in the social sciences, an outrage about inequality, injustice, unequal growth, to much more focus on aspiration. And I think aspiration has started with the debate on a better life in terms of a better economic life. But I think it has moved on in two ways. One is what Michael has called the performance, or the kind of the habitus, class habitus, and that is aspiration in terms of style. In style, I think we can understand in two ways. One is the professionalization. That is, it is much cooler to be a Starbucks employee than one in, a normal dhaba. Although you're doing the same thing, you're serving. But there's a complete difference, even if you're earning at an entry wage, not more than maybe 6,000, yet there is some class to it because you're learning how to conduct yourself properly, how you dress properly, how to speak properly, how you keep your body properly. So there's aspiration, not just in terms of earning, but also in terms of style, that is professionalization, and that is something that we no longer call actually modernization, but that we call global style. If you go around and look at the advertisements, all about being, adopting a global style or being kind of in a global space. It's no longer, modernization, which is a debate which we had, 20 years ago. And I think there's one more aspiration, and I think this is really significant, and that's an aspiration towards greater fairness. And fairness does not mean equality. Fairness means two very important discussions that are rampant. That is anti-corruption and transparency. This is where I see the second huge shift in the way people talk. And I think this is across academics and other sectors. That is not just that we are speaking about aspirations rather than about, the worries about unequal growth, but that we are talking about no longer just institution building and planning, but about accessibility and operationability. In other words, we are no longer just talking about we need a new institution, we need this, but the question is, are these institutions accessible? And the second thing what we are doing is we are not just speaking about planning for health, planning for welfare, planning for economic growth, but actually is that planning, can it be operationalized? Does it actually translate into outcome? So that today one finds in India very often feasibility studies as well as impact studies, follow-up studies, something that I haven't observed 10 years ago. So I think this is how India has moved on. It is in terms of a consequence of economic growth, but also a consequence about how we think, how we perceive, how we observe, and how we describe the consequences of growth. So this is, as much as I want to comment at this point, I would now like to give the word to my neighbor who has huge experience as an administrator and who has been the chief secretary of Delhi. And I'm looking forward to your comments. Thank you.
So good afternoon, friends. And at the very start, let me say that although I've done PowerPoint presentations ad nauseum, please treat this as just a drawing room conversation, because I'm going to jump from topic to topic just to give you a flavor of what seems to be happening, and within that, where does growth fit in and non-growth also. Second little apology I have to make, I'm not a busy person, but today somehow coincides with something that I'd accepted. Some journalists have to be given an award by me, so I'll have to leave because that function starts at 6 sharp. And getting from here to India International Center, as you know, at this time of the evening can be long drawn out. It will be embarrassing not to be there on time. So please bear with me at the end of what I have to say. If you do have a few questions and there is time, I'd be grateful if you address them straight away to me. Thank you. Now, I want to, as I said, this is a conversation. This is not a lecture or a presentation on a particular topic, and I will jump from subject to subject. I think everybody who may not be an academic is of the strong view that growth comes through the route of economic growth, and trickle down is going to happen and is already happening. That belief is so embedded in the thinking, educated, growing middle class that in a way that becomes the very aspiration of what people see before them as a future. However, the belief that the middle class will become more and more important, that they will be able to exercise some sort of countervailing pressure on corrupt governments and would be able to rein them back, and soon we would have a rational legal system in place. And permit my saying so, by rational legal is the belief that it will be almost Western, it will be almost modern, in inverted commas. There is that belief that it is going to happen automatically with growth. However, what happens in India is really not the picture that Edward Luce would have painted in Spite of the Gods, or what Giridhar Das has painted in India Calling, his beliefs, or for that matter, our very own Nandan Nilekani's book on Imaging India. There is a belief that India has a huge demographic dividend. India is going to have productivity and young age on its side almost forever. And therefore, we have nothing to fear from anyone, and we are going to not only have a double hump of opportunity, but this is going to be a superpower just because we have that kind of advantage. Now, as a civil servant, and having worked very close to policy makers and also implemented government policy, what I want to share with you is the fact that very often, whether it's a coalition government or whether it is a majority government, the policy makers as we see them leave legislation out of it, but day-to-day policy, when it is made in the ministries of the government of India, when it is made in state governments, when chief ministers say ye kar do kind of decision, does it get transformed into reality immediately? Secondly, is it driven by the need to reduce inequality? Is that at the back of people's mind when thinking goes on? I'm sorry to say, more often than not, it is not so. It is definitely looking after constituencies, looking after vote banks, looking after what is considered marginalized, but marginalized because that will tomorrow translate into votes. Now, we also believe that India is going to go the way many of the Asian tigers have gone, and one day, maybe 10 years down, 20 years down the line, we would become another South Korea, maybe another Japan, maybe China, simply because of the fact that we would be able to translate our productivity into income through manufacture. That is not happening. The whole attitude towards labor laws, many of them are really outdated, and I don't have to come here to tell you that. There is very little thinking on that score because that would upset a huge constituency. It would upset all the balancing that goes on with different political forces. And if that does not happen, we would continue to have the low-end labor and many of them stuck in the route of unorganized labor. So if the manufacturing dream is not going to be a reality in the very near future, we are then completely at the only thing that can happen is the service sector will grow and grow more. But the service sector in its very nature has given us some great opportunities. It has certainly done a lot for what we can consider to be consequences of the growth that the service sector have given us. And for instance, let me give an example. If you look at just cable TV, you as academics would be more familiar than me with the work of Oster and Jensen in the National Bureau of Economic Research when they found that an Indian cable TV has had the impact of doing several things to women's lives. It has, for instance, reduced the sun bias. I have not gone into methodology, but that is the conclusion. It has been able to give women some sort of a voice in terms of contraception. It has been able to prevent the notion that if 7 factors take place, then wife beating is perfectly acceptable, which is part of the NFHS and so many other reports. So if cable TV could have done that, well, in a way, we're leapfrogging in terms of consequences and impact, much more than could have been expected in many other ways. Now, when one looks at this whole question of growth, there is a huge migration taking place. Delhi alone gets 500,000 people settling down in Delhi every year, new people. And they're not necessarily the skilled and the educated always. There are a lot of people who are driven out of their small holdings want to eke out a living in Delhi, who see a future in being able to live better, maybe in slum conditions, but better than they were exposed to when they were in their hometowns or their villages. What does that bring with it? It brings social tension. It brings the kind of problems which maybe, let me say something nearer home since I'm alive to it. You have urban villages, you have Munirka village near JNU, you have the Shapurjat village near Panchsheel Park. So you have the not so well off people who are original residents in one sense, staying cheek by jowl next to the posh colonies. The posh colonies need them, and they also need the slums that are growing not too far away. But each would rather, I mean, at least the posh colonies would rather have their work done, but nothing beyond that. But social tensions arise when? When communities say, do not use my access, do not use my playgrounds, your children will not play cricket in the colony playgrounds, immediately there is huge social tension. These are the social consequences of the kind of growth that is taking place. Another consequence which I wish to share with you is that of water. There's a huge water shortage in Delhi, and that water shortage is much more in, say, South Delhi and in Southeast Delhi, not so in East Delhi, not so in North Delhi. So if you have disparity in water supply, you also have a situation where the planning machinery is not taking that into account. Overnight, an order issues that you can construct another story. That only means more congestion. There's nothing wrong with it at all. We can afford to do it, but can we afford to do it without water? Who is looking at groundwater levels? Delhi as a whole is probably as deficient as about 800 blocks in the country, but among them we are among the poorest. We depend for water on Haryana and on Uttar Pradesh. And when irrigation season goes up, the first thing that happens is they cut off your water supply, or they dump industrial waste, with the result that we are unable to treat that water, with the result that even if the water comes, you're unable to get the kind of supply you need. If you see the kind of fights that take place in many places in Delhi, it could be the Vasant Vihars and Vasant Kunjas, it could also be Sangam Vihars and Uttam Nagar and places like that, where people are not getting the piped water supply, what to speak of metered water supply. Now, these are the consequences of the kind of haphazard growth which takes place first because of in-migration. The fact that no planning has taken place, unauthorized colonies mushroom up, and then they demand and they become a huge vote bank, and what was planned for the actual people of Delhi who are residents and pay taxes has to be spent on them willy-nilly. The point I'm making is, do planning and do the economic theories and do the the people who are in charge of the political decision making look at these factors? No, they do not look at these factors. The factor to be determined is, there is congestion in Delhi, allow people to construct. That kind of a decision making can lead to consequences which are going to have manifold impact on the kind of lives we wish to lead and the kind of quality of life that we imagine Delhi is seeing. I was a part of the Bhagidari process, and when you talked about transparency and also accountability, I think Bhagidari, and that is what gave Sheila Dikshit, the Chief Minister for 3 terms, her biggest strength, and the fact that she was able to win 7 MP seats 5 years ago in Delhi. It all came by the fact that she was able to harness the people to understand first how systems work, how they can work the systems, how they can complain, how they can use the hierarchy and go higher and higher and get their demands met through right to information, right through the Bhagidari process, the resident welfare associations. All that was definitely a sign of a kind of, I would say, bringing people into the fold. And so in one sense, the middle class got a voice and the middle class were able to express themselves. On the other hand, what did not happen is the fact that this could not really sustain for too long, because it was not as though the public of Delhi, who were the RWAs, are going to be satisfied for all times to come with their day-to-day problems. They are going to be hit by price rise, they're going to be hit by inflation, they're going to see the scams on television. So when the time comes to boot out a government, they don't think about transparency, accountability. They think of, how do I just kick this government out? And so you had the coming in of the Aam Aadmi Party. Now, the talk is not on the Aam Aadmi Party, but it is a clear indication of the first point that I was making, that the middle class is not necessarily going to be rational and legal. They are going to hit out when they want to, and they're going to express themselves with both their feet. If that happens, then you have to be clear that the social consequences of this kind of, and Delhi certainly is a growth story. I mean, certainly some of the measures, the policy measures which were taken were fantastic, and you can't really say that nothing has happened in Delhi, but they are all the, you might say, typical notions of more roads, more flyovers, better public transport, CNG in the buses, better quality air, greening of Delhi. These were considered to be hallmarks of progress, hallmarks of growth. But whether it will translate into what the political voice wants is not very certain. Now, I want to move into an area which I'm more familiar with, because I was in the Ministry of Health for 10 continuous years, and then again back for the next 4 years in one way or the other. So I want to just share with you 2 or 3 nuggets of information. We do know, for instance, that fertility, the total fertility rate, is what is going to determine whether women have the number of children they want, which should be ideally 2.1, and would we be able to ensure that they get the kind of contraception that they would need to be able to keep that up. Now, in terms of policy, we've been following a huge family planning program. But if you look at where India has gone, we still have Bihar, which is going to take 16 years more to reach the replacement level, and no, 19 years more, and Uttar Pradesh, which will take 16 years more. Of course, 21 states have achieved a replacement level, so in a way we have a lot to crow about. But what has been the, I would say, the change that one should have expected with the kind of planning process that has always sort of so much time is spent on it? One would have expected that women would have been given the choice to use the contraceptives that they would have liked to use. The pill and the condom, being a basket of contraceptives being given to them, is of no avail, because it is very much very well known that if the pill doesn't suit you and the condom is not used, you are still stuck with the outcomes, which are unwanted births and repeated pregnancies. Now, even Muslim countries, take Indonesia, have moved to injectables. China has used IUCD for 40% of its population. It gives you reversal of the spacing that you're doing overnight, but India has not chosen to do it. Now, as a policymaker, when I have worked in the ministry and watched how this is handled, it is not considered as something which would help you to grow. There's never been an economic analysis of the fact that had you invested in giving them this choice, what are the benefits that would have accrued to you in economic terms. So in a way, the impact that one is trying to see through the process of growth, everybody wants growth, but without looking at the tools that are available, and the tools are there for the asking, but are not being used. We are submerged by worries about what will the left say if you use injectables. Just sterilize women. We are the only country in the world which does about 72% of the contraception. I mean, the limitation is through sterilization, female sterilization. Now, I'm saying you may well ask, what has this got to do with the social consequences of growth? It has huge implications for growth, because if women don't have that control over reproduction, they would never be able to reach the mainstream. And I would like to also mention two more facts. One is the fact that long before education and health come are the cultural conditions under which many of our states are still living. And there is this Social Institute, this gender index, which was been done by the OECD, and the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation have a technical steering group, which I head. And that for the world came to the conclusion, not for India alone, but for the world, that there are 5 really issues which have to be looked at, which are discriminatory institutions for which work against women. And these are really in the area of discriminatory family code, which is personal laws which vary according to religion, restricted physical integrity, which is the rape and sexual harassment and domestic violence. And then you have things like no access to property, no access to land, no access to, you might say, movable property, having to put up with the sun bias, which is rampant. These are some of the factors which are discriminatory, which go long before education and health come into the picture. Women can never aspire for all that till this comes. But what do you have? You have a situation where age of marriage is of little concern. Only now has adolescent health and adolescent marriages been taken into consideration. It's a very, very recent origin. So when this happens, there is a tendency from the social growth point of view, the impact is that at one level you talk of education and health, but at another we haven't as a country cross the hurdles of discrimination against women, which are cultural, which are traditional, which are very, very much rooted in the society we live in. And they are not all homogeneous. What the discriminatory institutions in North India are quite different. In fact, states, even at a subnational level, what is considered discrimination in North India and some of the northern states may not be an issue in the South, but South also has its own discriminatory institutions. To study this, we are trying to do a project which will look at what would make the greatest impact in which state. If 20 things can be done for women's empowerment, which would matter the most? I'm giving this example to show that when one talks about growth, the belief that growth will come automatically and it will percolate down is not going to happen in the Indian context, in my view, for 3 reasons. And I'll wrap that up. First is that policymakers are not at all geared towards looking at issues like the benefits, the economic benefits of strategies and policies which would spiral growth. They are looking at growth in terms of what does the budget announce in terms of money for my ministry, money for doing certain things, money for programs, money for being spent on projects, hospitals. But the fact that there's a lot which can be done without very much money, but which would have a huge multiplier effect, is forgotten at a policy level. And for bureaucracy, you may say, what were you doing when you were sitting in the ministry for so many years? The fact is, it is impossible to get the attention of people who would make policy in this direction. It's always incremental, and it has a deleterious effect on what we could have achieved. Our total fertility could have come down years ago if more attention had been paid to the fact that there are contraceptive choices which women could have been given, which were not. Second issue that I wanted to say was that the social consequences can be huge. As I was telling you about cable TV, mobile phones. When I was in the Jansankhya Sthirata Kosh, we used the call center, BPO, not a helpline, to run mobile phone. I mean, you could ring a toll-free number and ask any question on reproductive health, and questions came from Purnia and Kishanganj in Bihar. So that was a huge, you might say, achievement in terms of opening out to women who usually would be unable to put a question to anybody within the family or outside, or men who wanted to put questions. They could do it in the privacy of just using a mobile phone outside the house and asking questions, and it was toll free. So in a way, that is the kind of advantage that growth will bring. But the disadvantage that I was trying to say was that the the factors which are going to affect the population in terms of, you might say, social barriers, discriminatory barriers, a middle class which is pulling in very many different directions. They are going to migrate into cities in large numbers, and they will always have different aspirations. How can politicians satisfy those aspirations? These are going to be huge issues, and I do feel that the social consequences of growth would be definitely beneficial in many ways, but not necessarily the kind of fairy tale story that is believed to automatically happen. And mere investment in education, health, which is the Amartya Sen story as opposed to the Jagdish Bhagwati approach, well, that also is absolutely necessary, there's no doubt about it, but not without doing many things which do not cost money but may cost votes. People will not do those things, and without doing those things we will be taking 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
You so much. Thank you for a very sort of comprehensive view of. No, but you know, I wanted to ask you about this fundamental relationship that your talk focused on, which is that between the politicians and the bureaucrats. And what you suggested was that planners, even well-intentioned planners, may have certain steps that they recognize they need to take, but it's politicians who are either unwilling or are obstructive about taking these steps because of the kind of electoral and other concerns they have. There you primarily, and I think that is a question that's always, it's a fundamental question in India about the relationship between democracy and a certain kind of populism that you're referring to when you talked about densification. Because densification isn't a policy that benefits only elites. Everybody wants, who even owns a small house in Lakshmi Nagar, would love to put up another store. So you're talking about the dangers of populism. But those dangers of populism in a democracy, that question is always going to be there about how you manage to steer clear of them. And the question is always going to have a political answer. No amount of good policy planning can, help us avoid the question of what is going to win elections. So what do you see as the solution to trying to, transcend this eternal dilemma of the difference between good policy and the fact that people have to win elections, make money, satisfy different kinds of constituencies, both elite ones as well as large vote banks and so on?
Yes, it's been a dilemma, and I'll answer your question with just an example. I was in the Ministry of Health, and the writing was on the wall. Tobacco, and chewing tobacco particularly, was causing probably the maximum number of oral cancer deaths, which put together were more than HIV, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis put together. That should have been earth-shattering for any minister, and would have been something for which he could have had the power to increase excise duty by talking to the Ministry of Finance. Antule, Abdul Rahman Antule was the health minister, and he was from Maharashtra. I'm a Maharashtrian. I knew him well. I had very good working relationship. He was a very bright man. He was a barrister. And it wasn't difficult to get his attention. It was not at all difficult to tell him the problem of doing nothing and problem of sitting and doing it incrementally, that you're sitting on something which is so avoidable, so easily avoidable, and the kind of money we are pouring into cancer, and now much more, and now of course CVDs and diabetes and all the story is the same. It is, in a way, it comes back to unhealthy lifestyles, eating this chewing tobacco, and then of course sedentary lifestyles, food which is bad for you, and you get into problems with diabetes and all, which is a sedentary problem, another social consequence of growth. Well, the answer that Mr. Antule gave me was, I could see a twinkle in his eye. He said, why don't you go and meet Mr. Venkataswamy? He is the Minister for Labor, and all this business, I mean, you know, there'll be a huge ruckus from the Labor Ministry, so I'll talk to him on the phone. You go and meet him and you convince him. And I was a young Joint Secretary, was foolish enough to actually make that mission and go and meet the Labour Minister. And I went with all my facts and figures and everything that I could. And I was very articulate in those days. I was able to talk. He listened to me very, very, I would say, carefully. He took out his little thing and spat whatever he had been chewing. And at the end of it, packed me off feeling very good personally, but he did nothing at all. If I had to repeat that, and I had the knowledge and the experience that I did not have then, I would have said it is important that somebody who is an economist of great standing is able to convert this into numbers, not to the Health Ministry or the Labour Ministry, but to the Finance Ministry and the Planning Commission. That should have been done, and Planning Commission should have been ringing the alarm bells. Same with contraception, same with fertility, same with all these things that I'm talking about, gender. It's not a question of incrementally doing something. The alarm bells have to ring, not now, should have rung 15 years ago. Now things are going the way they should have. But it has taken 15 years to reach what we should have done 15 years ago. And that is the cycle that we cannot get over, because the only thing that we are on being taped on this, but I'll be honest with you, the only thing that matters is when the press gets hold of it and makes an issue about it. That matters a lot to the political executive, and that happens whether it is the central government or the state government. Bad press is what affects people, but not given as a report that has come out. Vivek Debroy has just brought out a report about, you would have all read it, that Gujarat is still the top and Bihar has done exceedingly badly on the freedom area, but has done exceedingly well in terms of many other social indices which have gone up. But that report, how many people are going to read it? How many people may get one editorial and that's the end of story? But if it becomes an issue which has to be confronted every day, politicians definitely react. Second place where they react is when there is a starred question in Parliament and they have to, for 1 hour, concentrate on a starred question which is going to come up. It's another matter that Parliament doesn't work of late, but when in my time I do remember that it was important, whether it was organ transplant or whether it was a question of bidis and cigarettes and gutka, that was the time you could get the attention of the minister and he would be bothered. So I think if I had all the experience I had at that time, I couldn't have done it as a young officer, but as a bureaucracy, I wish we could put our somehow heads together to get an economic analysis which is earth-shattering enough to make the ministries that matter sit up, not the line ministries. They don't matter in these matters. Second, to get the press to be able to bring out the fact that this has been, alarm bells are ringing and you're doing nothing about it.
It was a very nice really presentation, and of course I agree with you on many points, but maybe I have some disagreements also, and this is quite a different point. You spoke about Delhi's problems on policy planning and what happened in the last few years. I agree very much. I think I also personally feel that the outgoing government had to face this, the influx of the huge number of people coming in. And you need to have planning in anticipation for that. But there is a larger scene also. Personally, I am also one of the middle class migrants you are speaking of, possibly a push factor, not the pull factor also. Now, there is a larger scene also. Why this congestion is occurring in Delhi, which is unmanageable. Whether in terms of water, you manage one thing, another thing will go amiss. That is because of the skewed development also. We thought we are going to have a balanced development in the country. But most of these eastern regions will find people are moving in from different places. That is another, ambit of planning only, but maybe it's a very broader area. Thank you.
Actually, madam, we have not mentioned anything about the socially disadvantaged section of population like SC, ST, and other OBC. If you see the indicators like mortality, fertility, IMR, all these indicators are very high among these groups of population. But what happened during this growth scenario for this section of people? I think they are still living in slums, are leading better life in the slums. So I think the advantages of this growth has not reached to these section of population, I think.
But I just wanted to read out something which I pulled out recently. This is Arakswamy, who is writing in EPW. It's an oldish article, 2009. But NFHS data, studying that, he says, increasing contraceptive prevalence has been larger and faster among illiterate and uneducated women, and in that I would put the really socially disadvantaged. He's talking about people who had neither education and totally illiterate, than those with schooling. Remarkable demographic behavior which has given significant direct health benefits to women and children, almost equal to what educational movement has done for progress in human development. So if the tools are made available, it is not as though we cannot cross the hump, not on everything, but on some things, which is, for instance, being able to give women the capacity, the reproductive right to be able to control their own lives. That is something that can be done regardless of Dalit and scheduled caste and disadvantage, because this shows that it has been absorbed by those very women more than anyone else. So I'm not trying to give a kind of cherry on the cake just to finish what I'm saying, but honestly I feel that there are many strategies which can be followed which do not really require to have money and that incremental and that percolation kind of an approach. It can reach directly, we're not doing it.
Okay, then Sanjay, no, okay, then I think we can
take care. Thank you so much for having me here. I enjoyed being here.
Thank you, Sada. Thank you. I'm sorry I missed some of the presentations this morning and evening, and I just got the last two. So I'm just building up on the threads that you have outlined in terms of aspirations, greater fairness, tracking, and institution building. I'm really trying to offer on, Jaguri is an organization that's worked on the ground and basically on issues of ending violence against women for the last 30 years. And I'm offering insights from the ground where we've been for the last many, many years. And from the outside, from literally the borders of Delhi, where we work with resettlement colonies, with communities that have basically experienced exclusion and see a different kind of a growth trajectory than, and that also from a gender and a rights lens. So I'm not offering any kind of an understanding of what could be the answers, but we have worked very hard to make violence against women an issue of political importance, and it took the unfortunate December gang rape case to really bring it to the attention of the politicians, the media, and the community at large. However, let me just, Jaguri has been working on providing services to women victims of violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, harassment in the workplace, honor crimes, early marriages, etc., etc. There's a whole range of issues for which they do come to our service centers. We have also organized collectives of women who have
been through the process of redress and access to justice, who have formed their own collectives and now accompany other women in the communities and reach out to families, reach out to the needed institutions around them. Part of our work was working with migrant women many years ago, about 10, 15 years ago. And in that process, as the city of Delhi was developing, booming towards becoming a world-class city, which we are seeing the effects of that world-class city, we were part of accompanying many communities that were displaced to the resettlement areas, Bhavana, as far as Bhavana, Balaswa, Madanpur, Khadar, and in recent areas we're working in Mularband and some of the other resettlement areas. We've seen the story of growth. I mean, we've seen what it's done to some and we're seeing what it's doing to the others without any planning, without any notice. Community settlements were disrupted, destroyed, evicted overnight. And there was nothing that they went to. They went to barren land. They went to where there was no infrastructure. They went to places where there was no school, hospital, any services of the kind, that in whatever way they had in parts of central and other Delhi, they had nothing when they were displaced there. And between 2004 and 2007, there have been a series of evictions and resettlements. So I'm trying to bring stories of women and our work from that perspective to how we see the growth story and try and understand what it has done to the gender dimensions of their lives, to the gender relations, and to the increased violence that women and girls suffer due to the kind of planning that's taking place. First of all, one of the issues that really disturbs most women and young people who work in the community is the accusation that they are migrants and they come and feed on the resources of the city and they are then responsible for the crimes of the city. So you're really beginning to start from a perception that most people have, and in most of the public and policy meetings, we always have to hear the crime rates have increased because there are more migrants in the city. The city is facing all these resource crunch because there are more migrants into the city. But I don't have to say this to an audience that knows it is this community that provides the informal sector services. It's this community that has to fend for itself without much of the state support available to them. So in this relocation that has taken place to Bhavana, we witnessed a complete shock that the families and communities went through because it resulted in girls being pulled out of school, girls and boys being pulled out of school, absolute absence of health services, and the fact that whatever social capital they may have developed, whatever community kinship they had in living as they lived in very difficult circumstances in the slums that they were in earlier, in losing that because they had to find their papers, they had to get their licenses, they had to pay 7,000 rupees. And what was not done was that the master plan which guides the city and the infrastructure development of the city was violated by the planners because they were allocated 12 by 12, whatever it's called, 12 square meter room size, as opposed to the fact that they were entitled to 18 square meters. So in Madanpur Khadar, some of them did get the 18 square meters. In Bhavana, they were given 12 by 12. And that too, a struggle. I will not go through that story again. I think we know enough of all of that. So what we're seeing is that the way that the city is being recast, the way the spaces are being designed, are literally lending themselves to far more greater violence and violations of rights of women who are already so disempowered. The playing field isn't there for them. The opportunities aren't there for them. Now, one way of looking at and we've done series of studies. I'm not going to quote the studies because we have a lot of that. It's available on our net. We've done a series of studies since then. The 3,500 family, a baseline kind of study in Bhavana that was done by Jaguri and some of our senior colleagues then. We have followed it up with recent action research studies, 2009. We've also done a city baseline study on safety in all the 9 districts of Delhi to look at what the data is telling us, and then also developed with a lot of partnership and pushing of the system to develop a strategic framework on how we could work on women's safety, security, and access to the city. the framework that we really came up with is that whose city is it and who has a right to the city? And one of the assertions that we wanted to work on was women's agency. We wanted to look at women's right to the city and to all the opportunities and spaces that the city offers. And it is within that framework that began to analyze and look at the circumstances under which they live and what it was doing to them. Our findings were showing us that 70% of women were facing sexual harassment in public spaces, and I have a lot of the micro data with me, that they were experiencing fear and exclusion. That because of the fear of violence, their mobility, their transaction of business in public spaces was also creating barriers to their free mobility for them to enjoy the opportunities and the resources of the city. Very often, women and girls had to manufacture legitimacy to be in a public space. You can be in a public space if you're going to school, or you're going to buy the grocery, or you're going to do work that is part of your private domain, or maybe part of your worker identity. But the use of the space in most of the cases that we saw was that you could not use the space to have fun, to just hang out, to loiter, whether you're a student. And so we began to see how male-dominated the public space was, not only in the heart of the city, and the students have demonstrated it through their campaigns in recent times, but also in the communities where all the women and men and families were relocated. We also found that gender interacted with other factors that causes marginality, such as ethnicity. We have experiences of what happens to those that come from the Northeast, from those that are from the scheduled castes, or the minority communities, those that, are in the lower rung of, and how it heightens and reinforces their exclusion. We also found that earlier, a lot of women tolerated and accepted sexual harassment in public spaces and community spaces as normal because it was part of your everyday life and you learned to deal with it. There was no one taking it very seriously. And I think in recent time, we found that that domain has shifted, the consciousness raising that has taken place intensively in communities, and the public narrative and the work that the women's movement has done has really questioned the normalization of such kind of sexual violence that women are facing, and talked about how we can be changing the terms and conditions of their rights to be their own person and to demand for equality. So when we talk about what aspirations women are talking about, today I think the young people in these communities are talking about their right to equality, bodily integrity, and autonomy. They are quite convinced that the restrictions that they're experiencing because of patriarchy, because of the inadequate infrastructure within which they live, because of the inadequacy of the services that they are provided with, but they are quite hopeful of the fact that they must enjoy their own personhood in the way that they'd like to move around. And I think that's a very important shifting point for us, because that allows us to negotiate, even within the community spaces, how they can, if they were given an opportunity, redesign the settlement, reimagine the city, reimagine how they would like to be located within the city. One of the findings we had of our study, and I will not go through that, we've used several tools and I will not get into that, was really looking at our studies of how inadequate provisioning in these settlements affected women in their access to water, sanitation, and drainage services. We really wanted to look at that because water and sanitation were never seen with a gender lens. They were seen as important, but not as a women's issue. It was seen more like an urban service issue, but never a women's issue. We also wanted to look at the fact of how women could negotiate for their rights in local governance in public provisioning and infrastructure development. So we did a very intensive study with the women on really mapping out all the public services they had in terms of where was the water, how was it available, how many times a day did they go to collect the water, what did the community toilets look like, what was the infrastructure, how was it designed, did they really look at women's needs? Because we found in our analysis that women and children in public policy are categorized, right? We have a women and children department of which 95% budget is for children and 5% is for women. And so when you look at what this does and plays itself out in infrastructure, you begin to see that community toilet complexes, water collections are really designed in mind for women and children. There is no understanding and unpacking of the fact that you have women with disabilities, you're pregnant women, you're older women, and they're not children. And their requirements of accessing their everyday duty of, of access to the public toilets is rid with so much of indignity, so much of difficulty that they don't really use the public services, and they have to look out for the forests which are disappearing. There's no provision for their menstrual cycle waste. There is no provisioning of looking at the woman in her own personhood. And this is how urban infrastructure gets designed, around the fact that they don't really look at how women are working within the home and working in the public space. The second finding that came to us was, of course, that they paid for this land, they paid for the homes that they built, that little tiny room, but they didn't have tenure. And now they're talking about tenure, and they only had license for a period of 7 years, which meant that whatever investment you made out of the little money you earned as a part-time domestic worker or a part-time worker, etc., you had to think about what would you invest. And many times the women, the girls, what did they want to do? They wanted to have, at least at night, a little toilet in their house, in this 12 by 12, where they have to cook, where they have to sleep, where they have to do their everyday business, was to build a toilet in the house, because it was quite dangerous to go out, because then you were sexually harassed. There were a lot of guys hanging around, it's far away, there was no lighting, etc. So you begin to see what indignities are heaped on you on your daily life, something that all of us take so much for granted, given the services we enjoy in the center of the city. Secondly, we also looked at what was the opportunity cost that women and girls invested or lost. What was the opportunity cost of collecting water? What was the opportunity cost for 3 times a day standing in that long queue through the fights, etc., to collect water so that you don't have taps at home to do your daily work? The third aspect was to map the entire colony to look at how does safety play itself out. Unsafety, what was safe, what was unsafe, which were the neighborhoods, what about the parks, who uses the public parks? And you begin to really see a pattern that's dominated by male thinking, by a patriarchal way by which cities and spaces are designed. Of my time. So I think when we looked at very deeply into the gendered implications of the current infrastructure, and we looked at the fragmented governance structures that Delhi has, because we have a state and we have a center. We have the police, which is under the center, and we have services that are fragmented between the municipal corporation and the New Delhi Municipal Corporation, etc. One of the findings that really hits us very deeply is to really look at the fact that how can infrastructure have a gender lens on it? The 12 by 12 space is so tiny that the private chores of the house are conducted in the public space. So we began to see the public-private divide in a very different kind of a way. We all know that patriarchy uses concepts of public and private, where women are relegated to the private, to do the domestic chores, to have limited access to education and outside opportunities. But we also began to see how infrastructure permeates and reproduces a new form of a private-public divide, where all your private chores, from taking care of the baby, to cooking, to your home-based work, is all in the public space outside your tiny room, because that tiny private space is really literally a no space, and you're a no citizen in any case because of the lack of entitlements. And so based on some of these assessments, I think, began the dream of how would we design differently? What is the vision? How would we do things differently? And women in communities, I don't really want to look at them only as victims of a process. I think the beauty of change is the fact that they can still dream, that they can still imagine that there is a world that they can build, that they do not mind going to the government so many times to ask for the same needs. They are depressed, definitely. The change that comes to them is very, very slow. It could have been much faster. There is some infrastructure development there. There are some services, etc. But the point of the fact is, what is their citizenship? What happens to them? And how can empowerment take place at a much faster pace if we want change?
Thank you very much indeed. Must say it. Thank you. It's a little disorientating for me to be at a panel discussion where my audience are to my side, but I understand there's some technological imperative that we have to have the arrangement in this form, and I'll try and make the best of it. It's also quite late in the day, so I'll be extremely brief in what I have to say. When Manoj spoke to me about 6 weeks ago about the seminar, I was informed that I should speak on, what needs to be done at the level of policy for growth to revive in the economy, and I agreed. Then I was told that the topic of the seminar is growth and social transformation, which I think is extremely important, and so I was happy. But yesterday I discovered that the panel discussion is on economic growth and social consequences. I'm not sure if I'm the best person to speak on this, but I think it's an important topic, and I shall certainly I do have something to say. I think it's clear that the social consequences of growth certainly vary with the kind of growth you have. I'm not sure there's any specific kind of social consequence of growth. I mean, so we need to be asking what type of growth is taking place. Without that, I'm not sure if this question really makes too much sense. Now, I just want to give you some examples. One of the debates that really took place at the time of when globalization was being discussed in the mid-90s had some very important interventions from feminists in the third world. And Naila Kabir of IDS wrote very strongly about the case of Bangladesh and how actually the possibility for women to work in the textile industry in Bangladesh, which was basically exporting apparel to the rest of the world, was empowering in the sense that it gave them some autonomy in a way that they didn't have it in the past. So to take a black and white view about globalization may not make very much sense if you are a feminist, for instance. This may or may not be true. I don't know Bangladesh, but I do believe there is some truth in what she was saying. Now, if you look at colonial India, for instance, some historians have argued that growth in colonial India certainly struck a blow at the caste system, for instance, which may not have happened if there was no growth in India. This is a complex issue, but there is certainly some truth in that. On the other hand, we can have growth in post-colonial India, and I can give you an example. Let me speak generically first. When you have growth which bypasses agriculture completely, it could actually disadvantage historically agriculturally oriented castes or agricultural labor, for instance. And this is not just a hypothetical example. In Kerala, where I live, which is seen as a model by some, for instance, where there has been substantial economic growth, not all have benefited equally. Certainly women have not benefited from growth in Kerala for the simple reason, or not to the same extent, because growth has been largely based on migration. Equally in Kerala, the growth has completely bypassed the agricultural sector, which has meant that the caste-based nature of agricultural labor has meant that a whole social group has been kept out of the growth process in Kerala. So I just wish to say that in general, to speak generically about growth and social consequences, I think problematic. I think we need to have some idea of what growth is taking place. And what I've said about agricultural growth in Kerala is also the case historically about the Industrial Revolution in Europe about 400 years ago, when agricultural labor was dispossessed, etc. So it really varies on the kind of growth that you have. But this is actually in some ways an opportunity, because the task and the challenge should be to try and orient growth in such a way that it has the kind of desirable social consequences or consequences that we believe are desirable. Yeah. In any case, from a practical point of view, the policy of growth by any means could be disastrous sociologically, and to some, from the point of view, not sociologically, from the point of view of social or sociological consequences. And in some sense, that is what we've been having in India over the past 10 years. Growth by any means. And I do worry a little bit, though I'm not anti-growth by any stretch of imagination, I'll come to that. And I do, it's also particularly worrying that a lot of the growth has been justified because it makes possible what I think of as distributivism, the government to be able to distribute goods to people left out of the growth process. Now, actually, both the present Finance Minister, Mr. Chidambaram, and our Prime Minister have made statements to these effects in very important fora, and precise citations are in my book, Economic Growth in India. In fact, Mr. Manmohan Singh said this on the occasion of the no confidence motion on the UPA 1, and Mr. Chidambaram has spoken about this, i.e. the possibility of distributing goods when you have higher growth, when he was making a case for India's economic policy in Singapore, no doubt inviting foreign direct investment. Okay, so as I said, from a practical point of view, if you take the view growth by any means, then you have to deal with the sociological consequences that come with it. Now, this therefore would lead us to ask the question, then what kind of growth is desirable from a social point of view? I'm afraid, but my responses are slightly economistic, but I would defend them. I would certainly believe that the kind of growth that we would think is desirable from a social point of view is a growth which provides equal opportunities to all sections of the population. I don't think that would be very controversial. But also more than equal opportunities, or as much as equal opportunities to all sections of the population, a growth which generates public goods. You all know what public goods are. A sort of crude approximation to public goods would be infrastructure. And that's the reason why I'm not anti-growth per se. I mean, why can't we imagine India with better public infrastructure, more parks, more recreation facilities, and this is also growth, right? So I'm not sure you should have a strong black and white view about growth, which some people do. So growth can be actually life enhancing. It depends on the kind of growth you have. So equal opportunities, i.e. for all people, sections of the population, all individuals who participate in the growth process, I think is one aspect of a desirable growth from a social point of view, and also public goods. Public goods, I think, are important, or not just from an economic point of view as infrastructure, but public goods are also important from a sociological point of view. Public goods are where all of us meet in some ways, people across society. So public goods really represent the what can I say, epitome of democracy in some sense, and that's why I think it is certainly a desirable part of growth. Or it is a desirable ingredient of growth, or an ingredient of desirable growth. I think that's the best way to put it. And I'd like to say something about fairness, which was brought up by the first speaker, and quite correctly. I think obviously fairness is hugely important, but I just want to mediate the proposal about fairness in terms of what I've just said. Fairness, I think, was mentioned as transparency in governance and accountability, and I think the word corruption was used. Is absolutely correct. We want incorrupt governance. We want accountability, and we certainly want transparency. But as far as I believe, as far as providing equal opportunities are concerned, and creation of public goods are concerned, the absence of corruption is not enough. So I think that's pretty clear, and we've seen some of this in some of our ministries over the past 10 years or 5 years. In the Ministry of Defense, for instance. I'm an anti-war person, but you certainly can't have a defense ministry which is only interested in not having corruption. I mean, you have to, make sure that the country, what is worthwhile, is defended. So absence of corruption is certainly not enough, as if you're concerned about social a desirable growth process. And I think once again, equal opportunities and public goods are important. So now the last part of what I have to say, what do we need to achieve this kind of growth process? Here I want to speak very, very briefly about India today and the historical situation India faces today, and the kind of growth process which would be desirable from a social point of view. One thing is obvious, and one thing which is clear is that the fruits of growth over the past 10 years have been very badly distributed. I mean, not just between persons, but also between poorly distributed, excuse me, across sectors of the economy. The largest proportion of Indians or the workforce in India is in agriculture. Agriculture is part of the economy which is growing the slowest, even relative to the past. And this, of course, to some extent would be the case, but agricultural growth has not only not improved, we're also not able to provide an avenue of exit for people stuck in low productivity agriculture. If they're stuck in low productivity agriculture, their incomes will be permanently less than that of others elsewhere in the economy. So we need to make this mobility possible. To make this mobility possible, I think it's absolutely important to have agriculture growing better and agricultural productivity increasing. Now, in addition to that, of course, you also have to have a population which is educationally prepared to make the move. I think both the earlier speakers and some people from the audience spoke about migration. I think it's also the case how, unfortunately, so poorly prepared are these individuals for migration because their education levels are low, their awareness of their rights, their awareness of how to deal with a rapidly changing social environment and a market economy in particular are limited. The kind of educational training or educational levels necessary to make it possible for people to migrate from rural areas to urban areas is much more than what we have now. And that apart, for agricultural productivity to rise, you need to have much greater, what can I say, public infrastructure, notably in terms of irrigation, and extension, etc. So now this seems to be a reasonable scheme for transition, and I think it's also been the way countries have grown and socially transformed themselves. Mention was made about Korea, South Korea by the earlier speaker, and that's absolutely correct. I'd just like to point out that South Korea made these transitions essentially by this mechanism, by much more productive agriculture and fast growth in agriculture, and also much more widely distributed education across the country, especially primary education, something which we've ignored in this country greatly. Now, before I come to the constraint in this plan, or what will constrain such a plan, I just want to speak also a little bit about, make a small mention about social mobility, which I think has been mentioned earlier. It seems to me that social mobility is something less that we should insist upon than the idea of equality of capabilities. Social mobility immediately implies as a kind of desirable path of progress, which I think is contestable. And it's from that point of view that I think Sen's contribution is profoundly important. I mean, equality of what was the question Sen asked, and the answer that he gave was that it's equality of capabilities, not even necessarily equality of income, for the simple reason that you could all have some similar incomes, but you could have different needs, and therefore this idea of society to equip all individuals with the capabilities necessary for them to have, to be able to undertake the functionings, as he called them, or calls them, which are valuable. Okay, now what is the challenge in this, in all of this, in this simple plan that I have outlined of moving people out of agriculture so that they have higher incomes and also agricultural productivity rises? One of the things that's probably very familiar here in the Institute of Economic Growth, where historically a lot of very important work on Indian agriculture has been done, is that agriculture, there is a certain very disturbing process happening in Indian agriculture, that the size holdings are just fragmenting at a rapid rate. I mean, agriculture is becoming extremely unproductive. You know, you can't really earn a livelihood if you're stuck in agriculture. So that's a profoundly important why people must be moved out of agriculture. They don't need to be moved to urban areas, but they have to be moved out of agriculture, possibly into rural industrialization, etc. Now, I want to just conclude here by asking the question which I've already asked. So what is the challenge and what is the constraint? The constraint is that we need to ensure that we have the, what can I say, the public institutions or public functionings necessary to make this possible. it's clear that the private sector by itself cannot really undertake a complete transformation of agriculture of the kind that we need to have, which I've spoken about, or to bring about this kind of raising across the board of educational standards and life skills necessary in rural India. Though the private sector is involved in education in India, it's not clear to me it has sufficient incentive to bring this about in a short period of time. So in some ways, I think it is, for want of a better word, governance which is standing in the way of us achieving this. It's very important for us to recognize that India is no longer a poor country in terms of aggregates. It's by now, since 2011, I think, the world's third largest economy in terms of PPP, or purchasing power parity terms. It certainly has all the capacity necessary financially to bring about this transition. But it is worrying that along with increasing spending in two areas, or three areas, all of which are important to the plan that I've proposed, in the area of irrigation, in the area of education, especially primary education, and in the area of health, much higher, what can I say, much higher public allocations have not been resulting in better outcomes, either in terms of area irrigated in agriculture, in learning outcomes in schools. You've all been seeing the, what are they called, the reports by Pratham, for instance, which have all these worrying results about, you know, children in class 5 cannot read text for class 2, etc., etc. And finally, there's also very important work in the area of, somebody mentioned IUDN, but there's also ICDS, which is a mother and child program which has been in India in existence for about 40 years. There are two very disturbing reports on them, one by the CAG itself, which the CAG took upon itself to do, which is kind of interesting, rather than the government of India getting the CAG to do. The other is a private study by a group of international researchers, the majority of whom were from India, and independent researchers, which is important because there is some credibility to the work. But the main researchers, or the persons who put it together, Lawrence Haddad and Sushila Zeitlin of the IDS in Sussex, which looks as ICDS, and actually concludes, unlike the CAG just point out flaws in it, but doesn't take a view on why the situation is the way it is. But Haddad et al. Basically conclude that governance is the problem. So I'm just trying to say we certainly have all the resources necessary now to have a desirable kind of growth process, certainly to ensure that you know, we build these capabilities, which I think the bedrock of any kind of democracy, but we're not able to have the, we're not able to implement it, including in the programs that we have. Now, a final point that I want to make, and I want to stop, is I'm not sure if somebody asked from somebody from the floor, or Ms. Shailaja made this point. I think she was asked, what do we do? Now, well, I'm an academic, so I can only do what I do, which is actually I try and in some small way influence the discourse. And I think here it is important. I think certainly both extremes of the discourse are not taking us very far as having a desirable growth process is concerned. One set seems to, well, from one end of the political spectrum, the whole thing still revolves around this mystical pronouncement of we want more reforms. You can guess which end of the spectrum that view is coming from. The other end of the spectrum seems to just speak about more social programs, irrespective of the outcome that it has. And so I think the idea is to move the discourse to a more kind of meaningful level, or meaningful stage, or meaningful position in the stage, if you are really concerned about the sociological consequences of growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Balakrishna. I think we have come full circle. We have started to speak about how to revive growth, that we need to support growth. And after the analysis of the consequences of growth, which some were positive, but we also realized that there's still inequality, that there is no sensitivity to gender, that there is insufficient attention to agriculture. I think the question at the end of the day is, how do we revive the growth we desire? And I think maybe we can spend the last session very much in the sense that Sunita has given us, namely, so then what is the growth we imagine, and how do we bring about not just growth, but channel growth and support growth in the way that it is the desired growth or the desired consequences in a social and economic sphere. Any more questions or comments at this point? Okay, so we have two back there.
I have two questions for Sunita here and also one for Professor Balakrishnan. First to Sunita here. Thank you for a very touching presentation actually. One thing I wanted to ask you is, you have worked with these displaced groups for a long time now. Have you ever tried to petition or lobby with the legislators of that area to provide better services to these people? Why I'm asking this is, all along we have been focusing on the political structure and what are their incentives for doing the things that they should be doing. Provision of services, basic services, will not happen until and unless it is incentive compatible to the policymakers or the politicians. So when I say incentive compatible, their incentives are getting votes, and somehow we have to get these issues onto those manifestos, or rather their program, political programs. Until and unless that happens, that will not happen. So that's the reason why I'm asking whether you have tried petitioning them or lobbying with them, and what are the problems that you faced if you did so. And to Professor Balakrishnan, actually you spoke about public goods provision, particularly education, or providing primary education or improving the quality of education. But one of the basic problems with, again, the same problem is that any public good, politicians are averse to providing public goods, for the simple reason that this provision of public goods is not directly traceable to these politicians' actions, and they don't translate into votes. So provision of public goods cannot be traced back to politicians' actions. Suppose if you try to improve quality of education in a particular area, so that takes quite some time, and by that time that happens, the politician will be out of power. And he wants only to take those steps which are directly traceable to his actions and which can translate into votes in subsequent election. So how do we solve this problem? Actually, this kind of problem is always there in the provision of public goods.
My question is to Professor Balakrishnan again, and it's somewhat related to what Shekhar just said. I think when you spoke of challenges, it seems that there are two challenges that we need to think about. And one is the fact that India is now in a very globalized scenario. And perhaps the things that you're looking for are contrary to global thinking, global pressures, global, reality of global finance capital. And so how you are going to achieve them despite that is a interesting question to me. And the related question is also about the local politics that Shekhar just touched upon. As our guest Chandra mentioned, that ultimately all of them can only work if they are compatible with the political system. And so whether it's private sector led growth or public-private partnerships or purely public sector, unless it is compatible with the power elite, it's not going to work, is it?
My question to Professor Balakrishnan actually directly follows from that. Actually, sir, in a way, what you're talking about is not so much the social consequences of growth, but your comments lead us to think about the growth consequences of society, because the very nature of growth itself is shaped by the polity that we have. So rather than end by saying that we need to fix governance and that the polity is the challenge, why not recast the question, turn it around on its head, and say we have the kind of growth we have because of it's being embedded in a certain political economy. And I think that would be a more productive line of inquiry, which would not leave us with this governance question, which is like with, with Shailaja Chandra's presentation, always a sort of question that everybody is always left with, governance, politicians, political will, which is all phrases which actually just, go back to saying examine political economy. I have one, question for Sunita Dhar. Jagore is in a very interesting position because unlike most feminist groups, it doesn't concentrate on only one economic class of women, but it actually looks at gender in this more heterogeneous way. So my question to you is about visibility, because of this experience you have in working with different kinds of women, that in the case of the public spaces campaign that you have had in terms of public transport and city and street spaces and so on, it seems to me that you've been much more successful, that it's got media attention, it's got lots of young people on board and so on. And that's a class of fairly somewhat well-to-do, well-educated people. Whereas the issue of the needs of women in slums, or even the fact that they've suffered this traumatic shattering of their livelihoods, etc., just doesn't get that kind of visibility. And of course, there's a third issue of the visibility of the 60 to 75% families who didn't get resettled at all. So they're not even in the bastis. So would you just reflect, tell us a little bit more about the way in which gender politics plays out in the public sphere in terms of these different categories of women? Which women have found more empowerment through the media, through new kinds of strategies, and which have?
I'll be really quick. I will run out of time. One is for Sunita and one is for Professor Balakrishnan. One is, Sunita, I wanted to ask you, to what extent it kind of follows on from Mita's question. But, there's been a lot of money that's been put in by international funding bodies like IDRC, for example, your Safe Cities project. Obviously, there's a great deal of interest in gender and how one articulates gender with policy. To what extent does the state actually care about incorporating gender into various sort of policy measures? One is the international funding bodies, but you also have to deal with the state. To what extent does they actually care that gender is actually something significant in terms of equity issues? And the other issues other questions to Professor Balakrishnan, I'm thinking about the capabilities approach, which is great. I'm glad you brought it up. But because one of the things is the capabilities are completely uneven, right? So the different people have different capabilities to start off with. So if you want to build upon people's capabilities, you recognize that at any particular point in time, people have vastly different capabilities. And one frequent answer to that would be reservations, right? That what you're trying to do is build up people's capabilities and recognizing that people have different capabilities. But many people would then say, on the one hand, you might say capabilities and growth should go together. On the other hand, many people would say, if capabilities comes via this particular route of reservations, that is anti-growth. If you know what I'm asking. That quite often people will say that that's actually that's not. But the only way you can recognize capabilities is to recognize that people have vastly different capabilities. Hence, you might say, let's have reservations. But many people say, but that's anti-growth.
To answer or comment.
To take the first question about petition to the local bodies, government, MLAs, whoever, yes, much work has been done at all levels, including we accompanied the women and accompanied the organization to really look at what investments are made into infrastructure, gendered infrastructure in these communities. It was very hard to get the data. But with the Center for Budget and Governance Analysis, we wanted to look at how much money is invested by the government for water, how much for sanitation, as compared to the rest of the city, and we found a great difference. I won't go into the figures that are available in our study, and we use that data for the women to start asking, and how much money should come into the annual budget in that particular district. And so we've used a lot of tools, women have used a lot of tools. They're in the forefront of much of this, their petitions, their citizens speak, meeting their MLA saying you had to get 4 crores, where is it, using radio interviews, using tools like that, even the youth. We involved the youth and the women together. It was important to take the young people into this process of transforming the community, because you needed to get the energy of the young people, the literacy and their time towards a more informed change in their communities. And it has, so at one level...
Sorry, I think the question was, did it work? Does it work?
with the politicians?
To some extent it works, to the extent that they begin to make these little pipelines and roads and repair a light. But that's not the real change that one's asking for. So I think what happens is that the local lobbying and petitioning also gets accompanied by a more higher level lobbying and petitioning with a number of groups that work in the city. And so you ask for not just one basti or basti 2 or model basti, you're asking for everyone equally for those investments to be made. So you have another process of working at taking the data out, getting to talk to the various agencies of the government, trying to also make interfaces at what needs to be done. And then there's a national level at which you put your issues out. Right now, before the state government, before the assembly elections, we did put out a women's manifesto, which was the 6-point agenda of the women's manifesto. You can see it online, which was signed on by all the 3 parties. The point is, it does not work because I think most people who sit in the policy and bureaucracy do not understand equality. They don't believe in equality and certainly do not understand gender. Gender translates to more programming for women as beneficiaries. So when we talk about the ICDS program, we may talk about the ASHA program, certainly these services are required. I have no issues about it. But I think what happens where you confront the fundamental hurdle is an understanding what does equality really mean across all sectors. We're not talking about, stir and spoon kind of an approach at the end of the day, because that will not give us long-lasting change. And that's where we hit the roadblocks, whether it means the changes in the laws that came in the anti-rape laws, etc. On the other hand, yes, things did move. It did move. With the previous minister in the Congress government, who was a very dedicated feminist, things did move. She did try to use whatever she had within her influence. We developed a strategic framework in discussion with all the bureaucrats, NGOs. We came up with a 7-point agenda. We developed in consultation short-term, medium-term. We developed a strategic framework of how change can look like, who can be engaged in the change. Because you know that some things are long-term, some things can be done, and some things did happen. The Lieutenant Governor's office did establish a committee in which they did bring on board the gender experts to look at all new infrastructure and develop a gender checklist that in future, whatever we develop, can we build in these kinds of indicators, etc. So a few things have moved. In the DTC, a gender module has been put into the drivers' training. Training has taken place. So at some level, sensitization has taken place. Structures are moving towards, and there's been a core committee under the chief secretary that had asked everyone to report on women's safety. But I think fundamentally the change is too slow. It's just too slow and the investment is very little. And we know that the 181 emergency helpline for women's, the 100 and the 1091 of police was very ineffective in Delhi. Jaguri did a study, Jaguri and Marg. And when the chief minister invested new money into 181, today 181 is so successful. But for 10 years, women's groups are asking for a national emergency helpline that is then connected to the continuum of services. So I think at the end of the day, what happens is that when we look at much of these services, we do not have a vision of a continuum, sustained services in which budgets have to be put, staff is to be maintained. It also happened in the case of domestic violence. The Act was passed in 2005. In the 11th five-year plan at the Planning Commission level, no money was allocated for domestic violence. And so then we leave it to states and as much as states can do. So I think the point to be made is that an investment requires as much planning as you would do for anything in the industry, in everything else, investing into people, into systems, into processes. I won't take too much time because I have 2 more questions to take up. Yes, I think gender, the safe cities, because the issue of raising sexual harassment and sexual violence in public spaces was really picked ground in recent times, and really with students who were experiencing it on a daily basis, and students' visibility and their ability to take it very deeply into their college spaces, school spaces. As much as we worked also in the communities, that got more visibility. Yes, there is an issue out there. I mean, I think the resettlement colonies where the issues are far worse, equally worse, doesn't get that kind of visibility because they don't exist in the eyes of most people. They don't exist in the eyes of the policy makers beyond a point. They're really invisible to the policy, they're invisible to the planning, they're invisible to the politics of the play. And I think there's a deep denial of the fact that they exist, and a few SOPs are seen as fundamental contributions to them. And I think it's the politics of where the numbers are that needs to be seen. The other point that you're talking about, the Safe Cities program with IDRC, UN Women, to what extent does the state care? To what extent does anybody care? To have growth, you need a caring community, you need caring spaces, you need caring people, you need a caring state. Caring and sharing is what we would say. But what's happening? What are we experiencing? We're really experiencing gated communities, enclaves, socially tight circles, etc. So I think that while there is an interest, there's an investment, there isn't enough. There really isn't enough that's happening, and we don't understand why. Because post-December 16th, what are we seeing? Around the world, there is now so many proposals. Everyone comes to Jagaru, we're the one-stop crisis center now, literally for ideas and community access and what has happened. Apps. Any emergency app, every CSR company that needs to take things. There are so many ideas that have suddenly come up out there to be marketed, which is good. I mean, there's a response, there is an interest. Violence against women is seen as a fundamental issue for taking on gender equality. But the point is, it's all instrumentalist, and we need to really move it into a domain of deep political commitment. And I think we do not as yet have a deep political commitment. We got some of the laws changed. We have no implementation mechanisms. We want death penalties. We want a whole lot of issues, but we have not figured out what it would be to be in an equal space free of violence. So I'll just rest it here.
Thank you.
The question that Shekhar asked, I understand part of it was also of interest to you. I'm not entirely convinced or entirely certain that politicians are against public goods. I mean, they would do anything that will re-elect them. So they needn't necessarily be against public goods. They're a bit lazy about working at it, but I'm not sure. So let me give you an academic answer first, and let me give you an answer which I think is probably more important. The academic answer is that we know from history in India that it is states where there is political competition that actually public goods and general levels of governance are much higher. And the examples that are given are actually Tamil Nadu, interestingly enough. Of course, though there's competitive competitive populism, televisions, and I don't know, something else, etc., etc. But it's also a state where the level of public goods is quite high, and interestingly enough, politicians have had time for that, even when they were distributing freebies. So another state which is pointed out as having political competition, interestingly enough, I heard Ram Guha say that, I didn't think of it, was, I believe, Himachal, which, as you know, has been showing very good educational outcomes of late. Over the past 10-15 years, the state has had some political competition. So that's the kind of academic answer. The non-academic answer is we should try citizenship. We want democracy just to give us all these things, right? We've got to work a little hard at that, right? I mean, there are, all over the world, there are citizens groups, there is civil society, you know, you should badger your counselor, you should make time in the evening. I mean, that's all I can say. I mean, so it's not clear to me. I mean, it doesn't help saying that politicians are against public goods. Firstly, I'm not sure that's necessarily true. And secondly, we're in a democracy. We've got to work towards it, work to make it work. I mean, I think so. You can't assume that it's going to necessarily deliver to you what you want. So that's the first thing that I want to say. The point about globalized world, I don't buy this argument at all. I mean, not necessarily from you, it's an argument in general. I don't think there are global pressures that we shouldn't have decent sewerage or, you know, that, and this is important because somebody mentioned villages in Delhi. I mean, and the point is that they also mention the poor living cheek by jowl with the rich, which is completely true. But they also, they live cheek by jowl next to one another. I mean, it's shocking in the middle of Delhi that you have such kind of infrastructure, absence of public health, etc., etc. I'm not convinced that finance capital has anything to do with it. Of course, the finance capital wants to dominate the world, but it really depends on what kind of democracy you have that you can ensure you have it. And if you look at the states in India, we focus a little too much on the center, I think. the states of India have very substantial freedom, and it's a nature of politics in the states which will really determine what kind of public goods that they will have. Of course, yes. Right. Here I agree completely, and I'm happy to have sat with somebody who calls herself a bureaucrat. I mean, an administrator. I agree with Ms. Shailaja. Actually, the amount of money we're throwing into it, we're not getting what we want purely because we're governing this badly. That's all. You're absolutely right. Finance capital is interested in influencing India, and unfortunately, I think at the academic class, and especially academic economists, have made way for finance capital. But on the other hand, if our political process worked better, there's no reason why we can't have far better outcomes. There's huge heterogeneity within India, by the way. There's huge heterogeneity. And let me also just say about public goods. It's a very important point that Shekhar raised, and also Ms. Sunita here, about time. There is, after all, even in Bihar, very substantial change over the past 15 years, right? I mean, of course, some of the numbers that we're hearing about growth in Bihar sound outrageous to me. I mean, I don't know whether they're true. And Bihar has very poor social indicators. But at the same time, there has been improvement, right? And Nitish Kumar's government has, I understand, made some progress. And there's political competition. I mean, he's fending off his predecessor, etc., etc. So this process is slow, but I don't think it is inevitable. But I'm just trying to say there is no option but to either bring about political competition or really by exercising citizenship to alter this. And as academics, we can only alter the discourse at the first stage. And I think quite a lot needs to be done on that, frankly, because I don't understand what is said by, frankly, as far as all these problems are concerned, but women's empowerment, and I'm really happy that I heard that actually infrastructure makes a difference with women's empowerment. Infrastructure also empowers people in general, not just from the feminist angle. So it's politicians' business to provide it. You know what I'm trying to say? So the discourse about what we need is important. I mean, you have some politicians saying that now that the elections are here, what we need is more reforms. It's not clear to me reforms are going to bring us public goods. Or frankly, let me also say, Mr. Rahul Gandhi going around saying that हमने आपको अधिकार दिया. Now, it's not clear by legislating rights you can really empower people. The question of infrastructure is profound and very important. I'm not sure how much more time, but I must answer the two questions that remain. Is it Professor Bhaviskar? Hi, very nice having met you. Your very important question, and I hope you don't think I'm facetious in answering you the way you are, where I'm going to answer. I wish to say in some ways, if you're interested in any kind of project for social change, at whatever level, somewhat revolutionary change, somewhat social democratic projects, you can't completely say the political economy will determine this. You have to bring about change. I mean, so in some ways, I don't see myself in the business of that. I see myself in the business of trying to somewhere bring about pressurizing the system to change. And I agree that, which is why I was a little uncomfortable about saying that, but on the other hand, I think it's absolutely correct. Governance is the key from an economistic point of view, in the sense that so much money is being thrown in, but we have no results. And I think it's important to have results, by the way. I really believe it's important for the poor to have public goods. I don't think it's unimportant at all. And I don't think it's just some kind of bourgeois obsession. Public health is hugely important, probably more important for the poor. If you live in the part of Delhi where I live now, which is called Katwaria Sarai, you'll be shocked that human beings live like this in the 21st century. I live in a gated community, in a publicly funded gated community where the infrastructure is fantastic. But just across the road, it just shocks me. And therefore, outcomes are important. And I just want to say, people who work in education, for instance, I don't. I do kind of macroeconomics. People who work in education do have very, very clear ideas about how you redesign the system to ensure that there are better outcomes, etc., etc. I don't know very much about it, but I think that's the way to go. So that's my answer to you. The last question, which Professor Srivastava raised, I think is profoundly important. I think we need to have a deeper debate about it. But let me just tell you from the point of growth, which is what you focused on. I'll come to the point that you raised, the 2 points you raised, or 2 ideas you raised: capabilities and reservation. Let me talk about capabilities first. I'm not entirely convinced that we necessarily start with different capabilities inherently. So there is a complete possibility for society to furnish us with equal capabilities at the end of a certain process, say end of schooling. So that I think I want to emphasize that. Now the second is, I think in this process, reservations is a red herring. It has been exaggerated by both ends of the spectrum. Why we can't have a schooling system for a start that provides most Indians with equivalent capabilities, I don't see, or rather, I don't see anything that stands in the way, apart from seeing that our systems function better. Neither reservations nor money has anything to do with it. Now, how serious Mr. Kejriwal was when he made the announcements that he did as soon as he was elected. He wanted 500 schools in Delhi. I think if 100 schools are built, which function very well, public schools, I'd be very happy. But nevertheless, he sent private teams out to go and do social audits. How long the enthusiasm lasted, etc., are different issues, but they're important. I mean, so reservations has nothing to do with it. And I think, when they were traveling by tube by the metro for the swearing, some journalist asked Mr. Sisodia about flyovers. Why are flyovers not done? And he answered, I think, completely correctly. He said, schools before flyovers. Yes, that's how you start. So you set the agenda, you try and work on it. That's all I can say. But reservations, I think, on this issue is a non-starter. I think it's too much is made of it either way. And also growth in general, not just capabilities. I'm not sure if reservations really either way stand. And I just want to give you conclude with this. There's a statistic today by Santosh Mehrotra. There's a paper by Santosh Mehrotra in today's Hindu, which is quite interesting. It's talking about social indicators and pointing out actually the sections of the population ostensibly benefiting from reservations continue to remain at the bottom due to state not functioning better. I'll stop. Thank you.
So I like to end this long day. Thank you all for your patience. Thank you everyone for the contribution. I think we had a very good debate, a good start off, and I'm looking forward to the next day.
Thank you very much. To Sunita and to Professor Balakrishnan. Thank you to all of you. Just a one quick comment. Please join us for a cup of tea. Is it just outside? And then there is a cultural program in the Sri Ramakrishna Hall. Please join us. Thank you. You're invited to dinner.